we're going to talk about how to process a crime scene from start to finish. So there's 5 total steps in processing a crime scene: isolate and secure the scene, document the scene, search for evidence, collect and package your evidence while maintaining chain of custody, and submit the evidence to the crime lab for analysis. So we're going to split this kind of into 3 parts. Before we get started with step 1, we're going to talk about your crime scene team. Okay, these are going to be all the people that are involved in processing your crime scene. It includes the first police officer on the scene, who's important in isolating your scene, taking your transient evidence, etc. Your medics, if needed, so if you have any victims who need medical attention. Detectives who will work the case. Your medical examiner if there's any dead bodies. Your crime scene investigators who are going to process the scene itself. And then your lab experts that are going to be back at the lab. All those people are considered part of your crime scene team because at some point in time they would be involved in any of your evidence or processing. So when you're approaching the scene of a crime like this one, okay, the first thing that you want to do is step 1, which is preserving and isolating your scene. You want to check for the personal safety and well-being of victims. That's your first and foremost all the time. Even if it means potentially messing up any of your evidence, you always want to make sure that the personal safety and well-being of your victims is taken care of first. Then you want to detain any witnesses, arrest any perpetrators if they're there, and then you want to actually rope off and isolate your scene so that anybody entering and exiting only pertains to the crime itself, and you're going to try to keep as much of the evidence in the correct locations without being contaminated as possible. Then you would start recording the crime scene. Things like transient evidence, conditional evidence, anything that would first be noted. The job of preserving and isolating your scene is the job of the first officer on the scene. They're the ones that are going to get there first. They're going to be the ones that are in charge of completing this task. Roping off your scene, taking care of who enters and exits, and starting to record all that initial evidence that was there. Once the scene is preserved and isolated, you're going to start with documenting your scene. This is going to be step 2. Okay, so document your scene. And the first thing that they're going to do before they start any of the actual documentation is they're going to do what's called a walkthrough. The walkthrough is done with the first officer on the scene, the crime scene investigator that's going to process the scene, and the lead detective who's going to investigate the case. All 3 of these people are going to be important because they're going to provide kind of different roles and different sides of the case. So they're all going to be involved in the walkthrough. The purpose of the walkthrough is kind of to get a mental reconstruction of what their initial thoughts are that have happened. Okay, so they're going to kind of do a reconstruction theory. They're going to know any transient or conditional evidence. Hey, the windows were down in the house, or we had a really strong smell of gasoline when we walked in. Anything that might get lost in the process with people going in and out of the house, they're going to note that. They're going to note points of entry and exit as well as any paths traveled, so front doors, back doors, windows, things like that. And they're going to record all the initial observations. Who was involved, what happened, where it's occurring, when, how, etc., etc. And then they'll also identify any special needs if necessary. If they need, say that there were lots of dogs on the property that they would need to take animal control, or somebody would need to take them because they can't process the scene before, so on and so forth. So anything like that. So the first officer on the scene, the crime scene investigator, and the lead detective are going to kind of walk the scene, and they're going to do an initial kind of process of the crime scene before they get started. Then the crime scene investigator is going to get to work for their part. They're going to be the ones who actually document the scene itself. It's kind of split into 4 parts: notes, sketching, photograph, and video, but they kind of get done simultaneously. They don't do them individually. So we'll talk about how to take notes. Your notes should include anything you can't see from photographs. So date and time, description of location, if there's any weather or environmental conditions, description of your crime, and anybody else who was involved. They should always match their notes to the sketch. They should be short, quick, bulleted. You're not looking for paragraph form, but it's anything to help them remember anything that's going on at the case at the time, so that if they have to go back and look at this case in 2, 3, 4 months, they can pull their notes out and go, oh, that's right, I saw this here, this was located here, etc., etc. They're also going to create a sketch of the scene. At the scene itself, they usually do a rough sketch. They kind of just take a sketch of where everything is located. And then they include the date and time, the scale eventually that they're going to use. They're going to include their focal point measurement, which are going to be the 2 walls that they measure everything from distance-wise. They're going to include distance measurements from their focal point and lengths, widths, and heights of the actual objects. The name of the officer and a legend. And then usually what happens is at the scene, they take all the measurements and all the information. They go back to the lab, and when they're back at their desks, they create the actual final sketch that looks like this. That's more secure. They have like programs usually that'll do it, or they can hand sketch it out, but they have a key. Okay, this is what the key looks like here. Here's your officer that was involved. Okay, that was sketching it, and then you can see, like, here's the body, here's where the chairs were, the table, so on and so forth. And it just gives them a feel of where everything was, size-wise, etc., so that they can take a look at that. And this is oftentimes what they enter into court, so people can get a feel for what the crime scene actually looked like. We'll talk more about how to create a final sketch later. Here's an example, okay, of a finalized sketch, one that was done by hand. You can see their scale over here. 1 box equals 40 centimeters, their room size. And then here's they had 2 tables on it, 1 here and 1 here. And then a focal point. And like I said, we'll go more in depth with this as we get further in. The next thing that they are going to do is they're going to photograph the scene. Okay? When they're photographing the scene, they're going to do the scene itself, which is going to be multiple views. So they're going to want like top views, side views. They're going to want all entrances and exits, any windows. So they're going to want like big picture photographs to give kind of a feel of what the whole crime scene looked like. And then for the evidence itself, they're going to want to do each individual piece of evidence, close-ups, different perspectives and angles if needed. And they're also going to want to include scale markers like rulers and things, especially if it's smaller. Because if you take a close-up of a picture of something like a blood drop, it's going to look much larger than what it actually looked like at the crime scene, so they'll always include measurement markers in there as well. They want to be thorough when they photograph. They'll take lots of photographs, but they don't want to go too crazy because they're going to have to go through and determine like what the best ones are. So they're not going to take like 500 pictures of one thing. They're going to take maybe 2, maybe 3, and then they're going to go through and figure out what the best one is. And then you also have an option when you're documenting the crime scene to video. It allows for narration, okay, for them to talk as they go through it in different perspectives. They don't oftentimes video unless it's a crime scene where there's multiple locations or multiple rooms. Like say a killer broke into a house and killed a family of 4 in every different bedroom, and they want to kind of take the killer's path throughout the house. They might video it so they can say, okay, they were here and then this is where they went from here, just to kind of get a flow of the crime scene. But if it's just like a 1-room crime scene area, a lot of times they won't video because they're not getting anything different than what they would get normally with pictures. So videoing the crime scene is kind of hit or miss. It's usually only when necessary. So those are your steps for documenting your crime scene.